Every morning, he walked into FBI headquarters with a badge, a clearance, and a secret. He sat in the same meetings as his colleagues. He reviewed the same classified files. He knew which sources were active, which operations were live, and which agents were about to move. Then he told Iran. For 4 years, nobody suspected him. The sources died. The operations failed. The bodies were found in foreign apartments. And he kept walking through that same door every morning. Until the morning he didn't. Vienna, March. A Tuesday. A man was found dead in a third-floor apartment 2 blocks from the Danube. No forced entry. No witnesses. The Austrian police noted the injuries carefully, broken fingers, extracted teeth, and reached the only conclusion the evidence allowed. Professional. Deliberate. A message. What the police report could not capture was what this man had been worth alive. He was a mid-level officer inside the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, recruited 3 years earlier through a patient, careful operation that had taken longer to build than most careers. His intelligence had exposed Iranian agents across Europe, dismantled procurement networks, and interrupted at least 2 assassination plots before they reached their targets. His identity was known to fewer than 10 people on Earth. By Tuesday morning, it was known to the wrong ones. The FBI didn't grieve quietly. It investigated. And what the investigation uncovered in the weeks that followed wasn't just a dead source. It was a pattern that had been hiding inside the Bureau for 4 years. And it was about to get worse. The Vienna murder wasn't the beginning. It was just the moment the FBI could no longer look away. For 18 months before that Tuesday morning, something had been quietly destroying American intelligence operations against Iran. Not dramatically, not all at once. Quietly, methodically. The way a slow leak destroys a foundation before anyone notices the walls are cracking. Between January 2022 and late 2024, the FBI launched 23 significant operations targeting Iranian intelligence activity inside the United States and abroad. Surveillance operations, recruitment approaches, coordinated raids. The full weight of American counterintelligence directed at one of its most active adversaries. 18 of those 23 operations failed. Not narrowly, not due to bad luck or poor timing. They failed in ways that required explanation. Surveillance targets changed their routines hours before coverage began, not days, not weeks. Hours. As if someone had made a phone call. Recruitment approaches were rejected by targets who behaved less like people declining an offer and more like people who already knew one was coming. Raid locations were emptied before tactical teams arrived. Sources went silent. Then sources went missing. Then sources turned up dead. 78% failure rate. No statistical model could absorb that number. No operational review could explain it away. Senior analysts ran the calculations repeatedly, looking for an alternative conclusion. There wasn't one. Iran wasn't getting lucky. Iran wasn't just good. Iran was informed. 7 sources connected to Iranian intelligence operations were killed, arrested, or disappeared during this period. Each loss was investigated individually. Each investigation reached the same uncomfortable edge and stopped there. Because the conclusion waiting on the other side was one the Bureau wasn't ready to accept. That the enemy wasn't just outside the building. The FBI director reviewed the numbers personally. The meeting was brief. The authorization that followed was immediate. An investigation was opened that would not appear in any official record. It had no budget line, no case number in the standard system, no name on any public document. It had one purpose: find who was inside. They called it mirror hunt. The name was deliberate. When you hunt a mole inside an intelligence agency, you are not hunting a stranger. You are hunting a reflection. Someone trained the same way, thinking the same way, carrying the same credentials and the same institutional knowledge as the people trying to find them. That symmetry made it the most dangerous kind of investigation the FBI had ever attempted. Fewer than 12 people knew mirror hunt existed. Its investigators reported directly to the director, bypassing the entire chain of command. Every normal oversight mechanism was suspended, because the only responsible assumption, was that the compromised personnel could be anywhere, including in positions that would normally supervise a counterintelligence investigation. Trust no one was not a dramatic instruction. It was an operating requirement. The team assembled for mirror hunt was chosen on one criterion above all others: no connection to Iran-related operations. These were agents who had never touched the cases that had failed. never attended the briefings, never seen the source files. Their distance from the contaminated work was their only qualification. They were told they were investigating a security breach. The full picture, multiple moles, years of systemic betrayal, at least 7 dead sources, was withheld even from them. The logic was brutal but sound. The more people who understood the true scope, the greater the risk of exposure before the investigation could conclude. Mirror hunt began with the failures themselves. Every compromised operation was mapped. Every source loss was documented. Every suspicious coincidence was placed on a timeline. Then the team asked a single question about each one. Who knew? The answer kept producing the same names. And one name appeared more than the others. Not dramatically, not obviously, just slightly more often than probability should have allowed. That was enough. The hunt had its first thread, and when they pulled it, everything unraveled. There is a framework intelligence agencies use to understand why people betray their country. It has existed for decades. Every FBI counterintelligence agent learns it early in their career. For letters, for motivations, for doors that foreign intelligence services use to walk inside a person's life. M. Money. I. Ideology. C. Compromise. E. Ego. Iranian intelligence hadn't invented this framework, but they had mastered it. They studied their targets the way a surgeon studies anatomy, identifying the precise point where pressure would produce results. Some people needed financial relief. Some needed ideological validation. Some needed to be cornered first, photographed, recorded, handed an envelope, and told the alternative was worse. The approach varied. The outcome was designed to be identical. Permanent dependency. Mirror hunt investigators understood this when they identified their first suspect. A supervisory special agent in the Counterintelligence Division. 16 years with the Bureau. Consistent performance reviews. No dramatic red flags in any background check. But background checks look for obvious fractures. Mirror hunt was looking for hairline cracks. They found them in the finances first. Small deposits. Irregular intervals. Nothing that would trigger an audit. Nothing that traced cleanly to a second job or an inheritance or a legitimate source. Just money that appeared without an obvious explanation. The kind of financial pattern that looks unremarkable in isolation and damning in accumulation. Then the travel records. Side trips that appeared in no official log. Brief, carefully timed, always in cities with Iranian diplomatic presence. Then the phone data. Gaps in location tracking during specific windows. Not technical failures. Deliberate gaps. The kind a trained agent would know how to create. Surveillance was authorized. What followed over the next 3 weeks removed all doubt. The supervisor was meeting someone. Regularly. Restaurants, parks, shopping centers. Locations chosen for crowd cover and multiple exit points. The meetings lasted no more than 20 minutes. Envelopes changed hands. Packages moved between them. The individual on the other side of those meetings was identified through facial recognition within 72 hours. An Iranian intelligence officer, operating under diplomatic cover at Iran's UN mission in New York, previously flagged in connection with surveillance operations targeting Iranian dissidents on American soil. A known IRGC operative who had been watched for years without ever providing enough evidence for action. Until now, the supervisor, 16 years, solid reviews, trusted access, had been meeting an enemy intelligence officer. The betrayal was confirmed. But mirror hunt investigators already knew the harder truth. One man couldn't have caused this much damage alone. There were more. The question was how many. Iranian intelligence had not built a single point of entry. They had built a network. This wasn't improvisation. It was architecture. Deliberate, patient, compartmentalized construction of human access points at different levels of the FBI's counterintelligence apparatus. Each recruit knew only their own handler. Each handler knew only their own recruits. The structure was designed to survive partial exposure. If one thread was pulled, the rest would hold. It almost worked. Mirror hunt expanded its criteria. If one supervisor could be recruited without detection, the methodology existed to recruit others. Investigators examined every FBI employee with meaningful access to the failed Iran operations. The criteria were specific: access to compromised material, opportunity for external communication, and any behavioral pattern that deviated, however slightly, from baseline. For more names emerged over 3 months. The first was a counterintelligence analyst. Her work product reached every significant operation. Briefing materials prepared for senior leadership, distributed widely, containing source identities that should never have been in a single document. Her system access logs showed something worse. She had reached into files she had no authorization to open, not through a technical breach, through social engineering and exploited system vulnerabilities, skills that suggested either exceptional initiative or outside instruction. The second was a special agent in the New York field office handling liaison with Allied intelligence services, joint operations that had subsequently failed, finances that had quietly improved without explanation. The pattern was familiar by now. The third was a technical specialist in the FBI's communications division. She had direct access to the encrypted channels used for source communications, the channels designed specifically to protect identities like the one currently in the most danger. The fourth was a staff operations specialist managing logistics for sensitive field work. He knew locations, timing, movement, the operational scaffolding that made the difference between a raid that succeeded and a location that emptied 2 hours before teams arrived. 5 people. For years, dozens of operations handed to the enemy before they began. The damage was almost incomprehensible. But Mirror Hunt wasn't finished counting, because buried inside the analyst's access logs, the ones she shouldn't have been able to reach, was evidence of something more urgent than the investigation itself. She had been assembling fragments, piece by piece, file by file, fragments that, combined, pointed toward a single identity, the one identity the FBI could not afford to lose. There are intelligence sources, and then there is Cardinal. The cryptonym had existed inside the FBI's most restricted files for 12 years, a human being operating deep inside Iran, providing intelligence of a quality and consistency that most agencies build entire careers without encountering. Terrorist plots interrupted before execution. Assassination operations exposed before targets were reached. Details about Iran's nuclear program that shaped American policy at the highest levels. Cardinal had saved lives. Repeatedly. Anonymously. At personal risk that most people cannot calculate from the outside. Only 8 people within the FBI were supposed to know Cardinal's true identity. The protection architecture was extensive. Cardinal's intelligence was processed through multiple intermediary channels before reaching analysts, specifically to prevent any single point of compromise from tracing back to the source. Communications operated on protocols that changed on rotating schedules. Every precaution that 12 years of counterintelligence experience could design had been applied. It hadn't been enough. The analyst, the one who had spent months reaching into files she had no right to access, had been working a puzzle. Not randomly, deliberately. She understood that Cardinal's identity was distributed across multiple restricted compartments, no single one of which contained the full picture. So she had collected fragments. A detail from one file, a reference in another, a communication log that shouldn't have been cross-referenced with an operational summary, but had been filed incorrectly 3 years earlier. Fragment by fragment, she had been building a picture. Mirror Hunt investigators discovered the extent of her progress and felt the floor shift beneath them. She was close, dangerously close. Intercepted communications confirmed what the access logs suggested. She was preparing to transmit. The package she had assembled, fragments woven into a coherent identification, was scheduled to reach her handler within 4 days. For days, if Cardinal's identity reached Iranian intelligence, the sequence of events that followed was not uncertain. Iranian security services would move. Cardinal would be detained. And what happened to people detained by Iranian intelligence for the crime of cooperation with America was not a matter of speculation. It had happened before. It would happen with brutal efficiency. 12 years of irreplaceable intelligence access would end. A human being who had risked everything would die, and the 5 people responsible would still be walking into FBI headquarters every morning with their badges and their clearances and their secrets. Mirror Hunt had days to stop it. The arrests could not be sequential, could not be gradual, could not allow a single phone call or a single message to reach a single handler. All 5 had to be taken simultaneously, perfectly, with no margin for error. The operation that would do it had a name, Looking Glass, and it was already in motion. Arresting FBI agents is not like arresting anyone else. They are trained in surveillance detection. They know how investigations work. They have access to bureau systems that could reveal unusual activity if they knew to look. They have colleagues, well-meaning, unsuspecting colleagues, who might inadvertently say the wrong thing at the wrong moment. One warning, one phone call, one message sent before the cuffs went on. That was all it would take to trigger whatever contingency Iranian intelligence had prepared for exactly this scenario. Looking Glass was built around a single requirement: 60 seconds. All 5 arrests had to be completed within a 60-second window. Not a minute before, not a second after. The agents executing the arrests were told only what they needed to know. Each team understood their target and their location. None of them knew they were arresting colleagues until the moment it happened. The cover stories were precise. Each suspect received a summons to a location under a plausible pretext: a budget meeting, a personnel matter, a source briefing. Nothing that would elevate a heart rate. Thursday, 6 in the morning. 5 locations: Washington, New York, Quantico. The supervisor arrived at FBI headquarters for what he believed was a routine budget review. He stepped off the elevator. Agents he had never seen before were waiting. His credentials were taken. His phone was removed before his hand reached his pocket. He was informed of the charges without ceremony. He said nothing. In New York, the liaison agent walked into a conference room expecting a commendation. He received handcuffs instead. At Quantico, the technical specialist was detained at her workstation. An FBI cyber team locked her system access simultaneously. Every encrypted channel, every communication pathway, closed in the same instant she was taken. The operations specialist was arrested at his home. Search teams found $47,000 in cash hidden in his garage. Not in a safe. In the wall. The analyst was taken at an off-site location, arriving for what she believed was a source meeting. She had brought documents she intended to photograph. The documents became evidence before she cleared the doorway. By 6:15, all 5 were in custody. No warnings had been sent. No handlers had been alerted. No contingency had been triggered. The network that had operated invisibly inside the FBI for 4 years was neutralized in 15 minutes. But the investigation was not over. Because the arrests answered the question of who. The interrogations that followed were about to answer something more dangerous. How deep did it go? And whether the damage could ever truly be measured. Isolation is a tool. Each of the 5 suspects was held separately, with no knowledge of whether the others had been arrested. No shared information. No collective reassurance. Just a room, a table, and the accumulating weight of not knowing. Mirror Hunt used that uncertainty deliberately. The supervisor broke first. 6 hours into interrogation, faced with surveillance photographs documenting his meetings with Iranian intelligence, he requested a cooperation agreement. What followed was a detailed account of 4 years of betrayal delivered with the flat effect of a man who had long since stopped pretending he had options. His recruitment had not begun with a threat or an offer of money. It had begun with a woman at a conference in Istanbul. She presented herself as an academic. The conversations were intellectual, stimulating. The relationship evolved carefully over months before it became something else. By the time photographs existed that he could not explain to his wife or his employer, the operational leverage was already in place. The payments came after the blackmail. $5,000 monthly at the start, $25,000 per meeting by the end. The money told its own story. As his value to Iranian intelligence increased, so did the investment in keeping him. He had told himself, in the beginning, that he was only providing low-level material. Context. Background. Nothing operational. This is the psychology of incremental compromise, the same mechanism that intelligence agencies exploit with precision. Each small step makes the next one smaller. By the time the demands reached operational intelligence, the distance between who he had been and what he had become was too vast to cross back. He gave up the other 4 without significant resistance. Their recruitment patterns followed variations of the same architecture. The financial vulnerabilities had been identified before any approach was made. The ideological sympathies had been mapped and validated. The personal secrets had been located and preserved for the appropriate moment. Iranian intelligence had not stumbled into these recruitments. They had engineered them. The analyst was different. She did not break. She did not request a lawyer immediately. She sat across from her interrogators with a composure that suggested she had prepared for this moment and made her peace with it long before it arrived. Her recruitment had required no blackmail, no financial pressure. She had volunteered. 6 years of access. Longer than any other member of the network. The most sensitive material passed to the most dangerous recipient because she believed, without reservation, that she was right. The sources whose identities she had burned. The operations she had dismantled. The people who had died because Iranian intelligence knew their names. In her view, they had deserved it. She showed no remorse. She requested a lawyer. She said nothing further. The interrogations had revealed the full shape of what Iranian intelligence had built inside the FBI. Patient, compartmentalized, exploiting every human vulnerability the MICE framework had ever cataloged. But there was one question none of the 5 could answer. Who had told Mirror Hunt where to look in the first place? That answer has never been made public. Within hours of the arrests, a message moved through channels so restricted that most of the people who had spent years protecting them didn't know they existed. Cardinal was told to move. 12 years of operating inside Iran. 12 years of calculated risk taken in silence, in isolation, in the knowledge that discovery meant a fate too specific to be abstract. And it ended with a single instruction transmitted through a channel that had been prepared for exactly this moment and never used until now. Extraction protocols activated. The details of what followed remain classified. The route is protected. The methods are protected. The allied services that assisted are protected. What is known as the timeline. Within 36 hours of the arrests, Cardinal was out of Iran. Alive. The source whose exposure had been 4 days away was beyond Iranian reach before the interrogation transcripts were even complete. The intelligence relationship that had prevented terrorist attacks, exposed assassination plots, and provided critical insight into Iran's nuclear program had been severed, but on American terms, not Iranian ones. That distinction mattered enormously. The prosecution that followed the arrests was the most significant espionage case against FBI personnel in the Bureau's history. The charges were constructed to reflect the full weight of what had occurred. Conspiracy to commit espionage. Transmission of classified information to a foreign government. And for those whose betrayal had contributed directly to source deaths. Conspiracy in connection with those deaths. Several charges carried the possibility of execution. 4 of the 5 defendants ultimately entered guilty pleas. Cooperation agreements were negotiated. Life sentences without the possibility of parole were handed down in federal court with the procedural efficiency of outcomes that had been determined long before the hearings began. The supervisor sat at the defense table and stared at the surface in front of him. He did not look at the gallery. The analyst went to trial. Her defense argued political persecution. It argued that her beliefs, not her actions, were what the government had put on trial. It argued that the sources she had burned were not innocent victims, but participants in a machinery that had caused greater harm than her disclosures. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. She received the most severe sentence the court could impose. It was later adjusted through the appeals process. She is currently serving life without parole. The damage assessment that followed the trials took years to complete and remains partially classified. What was confirmed publicly represents only the measurable portion of a larger wound. Dozens of sources compromised, at least 7 deaths directly attributable to the network's activity. FBI operational methodology exposed to Iranian intelligence in sufficient detail to inform their counterintelligence posture for years. Allied intelligence services that had shared sensitive material with the FBI quietly reassessed what that sharing had cost them. The full accounting will never be finished. Some damage doesn't have a final number. But the network was destroyed, and Cardinal was alive. For the FBI, in the calculus of an operation that had gone this wrong for this long, that had to be enough. It almost was. The FBI that existed after Mirror Hunt was not the same institution that existed before it. That is not a dramatic statement. It is an operational fact. The reforms that followed were systematic and significant. Financial monitoring for personnel with classified access was strengthened beyond anything previously implemented. Continuous evaluation programs replaced the old model of periodic background reviews, because periodic reviews assume that a person who passed clearance 10 years ago is the same person sitting at that desk today. Behavioral analysis was integrated into security protocols at every level. The assumption that FBI employees were inherently trustworthy, that the vetting process was a one-time gate rather than an ongoing obligation, was retired permanently. Trust was no longer given. It was continuously verified. The agents who had worked Mirror Hunt and Looking Glass faced a different kind of aftermath. They had investigated colleagues, arrested people they had passed in corridors, shared meals with, worked alongside for years. The psychological weight of that experience does not resolve cleanly when the handcuffs go on. Several requested transfers. Some left counterintelligence entirely. Others stayed, recommitted in the specific way that people recommit when they have seen the cost of failure up close and cannot unknow it. The Iranian intelligence officers who had run the network faced consequences calibrated precisely to their diplomatic status. 3 were expelled from the United States. They returned to Iran. By all available accounts, they were received well. The handlers who had recruited, managed, and protected 5 FBI moles for 4 years, who had built the most successful penetration of American law enforcement in a generation, went home. No trial, no prison, no consequence that fit the crime. This is the asymmetry that lives at the center of state-sponsored espionage. Democratic legal principles prevent the extrajudicial responses that would resolve the frustration. Indictments were filed. International warrants were issued. They remain outstanding. Cardinal now lives under an identity that did not exist before the extraction, in a location that will not be disclosed, protected by a government that failed to protect the source for 4 years before ultimately keeping the most important promise: survival. The intelligence access is gone. 12 years of irreplaceable penetration into Iranian operations, severed at the moment it was most needed. The nuclear intelligence, the assassination plot exposure, the terrorist interdictions, gone. What replaced it is the question no public document has answered. Because here is what Mirror Hunt ultimately exposed beyond the 5 individuals it arrested. Iran had been running this program. Patient, methodical, multi-year recruitment of American intelligence personnel with a sophistication that implied significant institutional investment. 5 FBI employees in 4 years was not an opportunistic operation. It was a system, which raises the question that the damage assessment authors addressed in the classified sections of their final report and have not discussed publicly since. If Iran built this system once, they built it again. The next network does not begin when the FBI discovers it. It begins years before that. It begins with a conversation at a conference, or a message from an account that looks legitimate, or a financial pressure that arrives at exactly the right moment to make an approach feel like a solution rather than a trap. Somewhere right now, an FBI employee with access to sensitive operations is being studied. Their finances, their relationships, their pressure points, their beliefs. The approach hasn't happened yet, but the file is already open. And somewhere else, in a part of the FBI that doesn't appear in org charts or budget documents, someone is watching for the pattern, monitoring the anomalies, waiting for the hairline crack that becomes the thread that unravels everything. The question is which side finds it first. It has always been that question. There was one detail buried in the Mirror Hunt final report that was not included in any public summary. One finding that investigators flagged as requiring immediate follow-up. It has been 4 years. That follow-up has not been announced.